If you did not see, with the new mini set, Hearthstone is adding anomalies to standard. This is because of the new card Cho'Gall Twilight Chieftain. This card is a 6-mana 6/7 taunt lifesteal, but the start of a game effect is really unique. 25% chance to corrupt the game with a random anomaly. Before we even discuss what the anomalies are and the good and bad ones, let's first discuss what the Hearthstone team is doing with the Fall of Ulduar mini set. The first week of the mini set, anomalies will be in every standard game regardless of what deck you're playing and what deck your opponent is playing. You will always have something that changes up the game for the very first week. After that 1 week period ends, anomalies will be active in 25% of games until patch 28.0. I'm not sure where 28.0 is going to be, so this is an indefinite amount of time, but I would say probably for a month or so. And on top of that, if you and your opponent both have Cho'Gall in your deck, there is a chance that you get 2 anomalies in your standard games. Let's just go through the card real fast. A 6-mana 6/7 taunt lifesteal isn't that great in Hearthstone. You're definitely playing this for the start a game effect. Now, when it comes to the anomalies, there are 20 different anomalies that can occur in a game of Hearthstone. So when they did the patch notes, they showed us 3 to begin with. We have Approaching Nightmares, which is both players start with Yogg-Saron Hope End in their hand. That is the OG Yogg, not the new Yogg that came in Darkmoon Faire. This is the more fun one and the more wild one. I'm a huge fan of this because I do think Yogg-Saron was really fun for the game, but I can understand why competitive players will find this a little bit frustrating. Then we have Gift of Gluttony. Both players start with 2 more drawn cards. For the most part, this is a pretty neutral effect, and I don't think that either side will feel like this is unfair. If the class you're playing doesn't have a ton of card draw, this is slightly more beneficial for you, but I feel like it's like a percentage difference. It's not going to be that bad. The next one is really powerful, Fast Track. Reduce the cost of all cards in both players' starting hands by 1. This one, out of the first 3 that they showed us, has the most potential to probably change the way the game is played. If you're playing an aggro deck with a super low curve like Mech Rogue, this is going to be pretty disgusting because you could probably play your whole hand pretty quickly. And if you're playing a late game strategy, reducing all your cards by 1 mana is not nearly as effective as reducing a 2-cost card to 1 mana. That means aggro decks will probably like this a lot more than every other archetype, and games will probably be over a little bit quicker. Now, these anomalies alone did cause some discourse into the community, but I was really curious to see what the rest of the anomalies were before I really formed an opinion. And I'm about to show you the rest of the 17 anomalies. And some of these I am not 100% sure on. The first anomaly is Shifting Fate. Both players start with a Gear Shift in their hand. Gear Shift is a card that was given to Rogue quite recently, which is basically an additional mulligan. This is actually a pretty nice thing to give both players. It's a pretty neutral effect. It might be slightly better in an aggro deck, but I could also see this being fine in a control or combo deck. I think this is a pretty safe anomaly for the very first one. Next is Surging Inspiration. Both players start with upgraded hero powers. This is one that I'm slightly concerned for because some classes do have a much better upgraded hero power than others. The one that comes to my mind right now is Warrior getting tank up. Getting 2 more armor per hero power is pretty great, and especially because Warrior likes playing armor right now, this will fit very nicely with the class. Other classes don't really care. There are very few instances, for instance, like the Warlock hero power is going to really make a difference. I could see this being a little bit of an advantage or disadvantage depending on what class you end up being. A Light in the Dark. Both players' hero powers cost 1 less. This one I think is fine for the most part. There are a couple of classes that I do think will really like this one. Warlock comes to my mind. Warrior again comes to my mind. Demon Hunter gets a 0-cost hero power. I think that's cool. Same as Death Knight getting a 1-cost hero power is actually pretty impactful. This one I think on average though is pretty safe. The upgraded hero powers and the 1-cost hero powers are still kind of getting played in wild. So this could actually make an impact on the matchup that you have. Uncontrollable Growth. Both players start with an extra mana crystal. Did you want Druid to be your class as well? Well, there you go, because this is basically both players cast Wild Growth at the start of the game. Well, that's what it is. It's not basically. I think in some instances, this is actually much more beneficial for slower archetypes than it is for aggro. The worst thing about playing Druid, for instance, is dying to an aggro deck while you're playing Wild Growth. If you don't actually have to spend the 3 mana to cast Wild Growth, this is a really beneficial thing for you. So I have a feeling that control decks will like this a lot more. Driven to Excess. Whenever a player ends their turn with unspent mana, they draw a card. This one I think is a really good way of doing an anomaly because it doesn't necessarily change the matchup too much, but it adds this little bit of a mini game inside that makes you think about, okay, do I want to actually spend all my mana or would I prefer a card? I think if they're going to continue doing anomalies, they should do it like this. The one weird thing about this one though is if you actually can't spend all your mana, you will be drawing a card every single turn, which means some matchups might go to Fatigue. I have no idea, but I'm excited to see how this one actually plays. Driven to Greed, whenever a player ends their turn with unspent mana, they get a coin. This is another one just like the previous one where I think it's really good design. I think this is another mini game inside the game where instead of drawing a card, you get a coin. I think this one is basically on par with drawing a card. This one again might be a little bit more skewed towards slower decks because getting the additional coin can help you play your big stuff sooner. But I think every single class and archetype will be a huge fan of this, and I'm actually really happy with the design of this one. I have a feeling I'm gonna regret that, by the way. Twist reality: after a player plays a card this game, shuffle a copy into their deck. For the most part, this is another really good design one in my opinion. I think it makes you think about what cards you actually want to put into your deck again. And we've always been in that situation where you're like, I wish I could play 3 copies of this, right? I think it'd be really, really cool. Does this favor aggressive decks or does this favor control decks? It's hard to tell. For the most part, you're gonna bloat your deck regardless of what archetype or class you are. I think this goes to an advantage if you have like more card draw naturally into the deck you're playing. Warlock probably likes this a little bit more because of the life tap. I don't personally think this one's annoying. I actually think that it's kind of spicy, and I'm excited to see what this ends up being in an actual game. It'll be cool to see if games go to a tie, because in control matchups, there'll literally never be a fatigue because you always play a card and always get one back. Next one, seeing double. Both players start with 2 copies copied from the other player's hand. This one is really interesting because not only does it give you slight information about what your opponent is playing, you do get 2 additional resources that aren't really going to be good for you necessarily. Like if you're playing a control deck, you don't really care about the aggro cards, but it may help you fight for the board and vice versa. I think this one is much better if you are playing a control deck though, because I would rather be given aggro options in the early game regardless and have my slower deck come later than if I'm playing an aggro deck and I get a bunch of slow cards that may not do anything for me. This is another one that I'm not too worried about, but I could see people being a little frustrated with this one. This one I think is going to be one of the most impactful. Severed Souls. Both heroes start with +5 health. It is adding Prince Renethal without actually adding Prince Renethal, which means you can have a 30 card deck with 35 health. That is a much bigger deal than you probably think it is, especially if you think about aggro matchups, right? That 5 health could be the difference of you living or dying, and some classes are really gonna like that and other ones are gonna be upset. This is one that I think drastically changes the matchup spread. For instance, Control Warrior, Control Warlock really like the additional 5 health, where if you're playing Mech Rogue, you don't really care about the additional 5 health. So this one is really dependent on the archetype and the class you're playing. Unimaginable Horrors. Both players discover a new basic hero power on their first turn. This is another one that I think is just not the best because some classes really rely on their hero power. For example, like Control Warlock really likes life tap. Without life tap, Control Warlock gets arguably much worse. So it's kind of unfortunate that you don't really have the option to just pass on this. You're basically forced to play the deck in a worse way. Hunter playing an aggressive deck and maybe they're forced to get like armor up is going to feel absolutely miserable. I'm not 100% sure on this one. I think people will find this to be a little bit annoying. Fortifications. At the end of each player's turns, give a random one of their minions +1 health. This one is very good for aggro decks, and I am kind of worried for this one. The best example I have on the top of my head is if you play a Costume Singer. It's a 1/1 right now, but making a 1/2 makes it that much more annoying to deal with, and that can honestly just win you the game on its own. It also is a very, very snowbally effect. So if you are an aggro deck going against a slower deck, you are benefiting from this much earlier on than your opponents, which means those breakpoints will actually end up mattering. I am not a fan of this one. This is probably the best one in my mind. Your eyes betray you. Both players' cards are golden. This is just a fun cosmetic way of enhancing the experience. Most people want to play with golden cards, so this is just not even harming the gameplay. It's just here you go. Here's some fun animations to look at. The only people who really get hurt by this is people who just spend a bunch of money to get all these golden cards because now they don't feel elite, but I'm sure the people who don't spend money are going to really like this one. All right, Shifting Futures. Both players start with 2 copies of Shifter Xeris in their hand. This one, it makes me laugh because I think it's just not even that good. There are too many minions to really grasp about how good or bad this will be. Most of the time, this is going to be not great. In fact, it's probably going to be the worst anomaly out of all of them, but sometimes, I mean, in very contextual situations, having a Shifter Xeris might actually win you the game, but I think that's not going to happen often. So this one's probably just fine. Control the Bakers. Both heroes have +1 attack on their turns. This one is slightly worrisome just because it does actually have an impact for both classes. Having the ability to attack on turn 1 can be actually a pretty impactful thing to do. And it basically says every single class has the Demon Hunter hero power without actually hitting it. And the Demon Hunter hero power is pretty great in terms of how far hero powers go. This one may be really, really good. It's kind of hard to tell. I am slightly worried for this one. Army of the Corrupted. The first minion played on each player's turn cost 1 less. Mana cheating is really, really good. This one definitely favors more aggressive archetypes than slower decks, because not only are you going to be using this more, you have more turns to probably play this than slower decks because you're running a lower curve. Little worrisome for this one as well. I don't like the mana cheating aspect ones. Hope I'm being just over dramatic here, but I could definitely see this one being annoying. Opportunity Knocks. The first card drawn on a player's turn is one they can afford to play. This one's actually really interesting, and it's kind of hard to tell how great this will be because having the option to always play a card is generally great. You want to spend your mana in Hearthstone, and this basically solves that problem. There's a lot less variance in your card draws because you can understand what card you could potentially draw next just based on what mana you're going into. As the game goes on, this becomes a little bit harder to tell what card you're going to draw. I do like it. I like the idea that there's always something to do, and it does feel bad when you just get a really bad hand, so this kind of fixes that issue. I do think it will be impactful, but not for the wrong reasons. Spread of Corruption. The first spell cast on each player's turn costs 1 less. This one is a pretty neutral effect unlike the minion one, because generally as a control deck you do have a lot of spells, and potentially same as an aggro deck. I do have a feeling this one's going to be powerful, but I think it's more of a neutral effect than favoring something over another. Now, how do I feel about anomalies, and do I think they're good for Hearthstone? I am actually a really big fan of Hearthstone trying things. I'm someone who doesn't really like when the metagame is solved. My favorite part of Hearthstone is like the first couple days into expansion when people are just trying some random stuff. This is almost the same kind of idea. You don't know what anomaly you're going to get, so it's really hard to build a deck around it. Even though some of the anomalies are going to be better than others for you, I do think overall and over a long period of time, anomalies will become a fun part of Hearthstone that we probably will miss. Now, the other flip of the coin is the competitive aspect of the game. Standard, by basically definition, should be the most competitive format in Hearthstone. And by adding some of these anomalies, I do think it kind of takes away from the competitive nature of the game mode, because it's 100% guaranteed that you'll get these anomalies for the week after the patch comes out. You may want to take a break, you may want to try it out and see how you feel, but generally speaking, I think this is overall a net positive for Hearthstone, and I'm actually really excited to see how it plays out. The most important thing is I hope the Hearthstone team doesn't get discouraged. I think trying stuff like this and innovating on your game is one of the reasons why Hearthstone is still around to this day. I am optimistic on this, but I could see people hating it. It's tough to tell, but let me know what you think about them in the comments. Do you think they're good? Do you think they're bad? Are you excited? Are you going to take a week off? I'm excited to read this. Thanks for watching.